Hello. Hey, people are starting to roll in. We're just gonna let everyone just take a minute to join us before we get started.
Can people introduce themselves or?
They cannot, so they can't
Okay,
talk, but they can say hi in the chat. So if you guys
okay.
want to say hi in the chat, introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, we would love to hear that. Yeah, that would be lovely. And we will just get started in like another minute or so. And I apologize. I'm having some kind of weird internet thing, so shortly I'm going to turn my camera off just so that it stops freezing. All right, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Eileen, and then I'm going to turn my camera off. So hi, I'm Darla. I am the Patient Affairs Director for the Alliance to Cure Cavernous Malformation. And I am super excited to introduce Eileen Benthal, who is here to talk to us in honor of Caregiver Appreciation Month. And Eileen has been a caregiver for a patient with CCM3 for a really long time. And I'm sure she'll tell us some more about that during her presentation. But we're extremely grateful to have her here with us tonight. And without further ado, Eileen, I'm going to give you the floor and I'm going to turn.
Thanks, Darla. So yes, my name is Eileen Benthal, and I frequently introduce myself as the mom of a miracle. And my daughter Johanna is 28 years old, and she was born with a very large cavernoma on her brainstem. That wasn't diagnosed until she was about 12 weeks old. You know, she had little things. Oh my goodness, it didn't seem like little things. When she was a baby, things that just didn't seem right, you know, a head tilt and her eyes weren't working well together. But it took 12 weeks to really figure out that there was something going on in her brain. And, you know, it's been 28 years of doing this. And she has her CCM3 is pretty, I guess the word that has been tossed around over the years has been aggressive in terms of, you know, frequent rates of hemorrhage and a lot of brain surgery. She has a shunt because she developed hydrocephalus as well. So we've spent a lot of time in and out of the hospital. She's currently treated at NYU in Manhattan, and we were actually just there today. And it was kind of cool that we ended up doing this during Caregiver Month, of course, but also during this week because this week marks 28 years of caregiving for me. You know, Johanna was actually the first brain surgery that she had to take care of the fluid in an emergency situation when they found the mass on her brainstem was actually November 12th. And that was exactly Tuesday. You know how sometimes your brain keeps like these timelines that you don't really realize. But it was this is the week that the days coincide with the date. And so tomorrow is actually the 20th anniversary of her first craniotomy, and she's had a few of those as well. So, but I wanted to share with you, I wrote a book called Breathing Underwater. And it's based on an experience that I had postpartum, and I wanted to share a little bit about that and how I came to this acronym that has truly, truly helped me get through and find meaning and purpose in these 28 years of caregiving. Um, so when Johanna was born, as I said, sometimes, you know, I felt like there was just something not right with her. But at the same time, I started to have these postpartum nightmares. And that's what I chalked them up for, was like postpartum. She was my fourth. And I thought maybe, you know, it's just being the mom of four or something. But I had this recurring nightmare. And it was, I was out in the middle of the water, in the middle of the ocean, holding my infant baby in my arms, and there was no land in sight. It was a very frightening dream. And it reoccurred, for many days and over the weeks. And then, like I said, when she was 12 weeks old, she developed hydrocephalus to the point that she had a bulging fontanelle. So that was pretty telling for us. And we were rushed to the ER. She They did an emergency CAT scan. All of a sudden, these little things that were kind of unclear became very clear. But I will never forget that first night on November 12th, 28 years ago in 1996, when the resident from neurology called us into the CAT scan reading room. And I'm really grateful that that initial night when all this began for us, a doctor decided to help teach us, what was going on by including us in to understand the diagnostic testing and to see. So that night, 28 years ago, I saw my infant daughter's brain up on a CAT scan, and her brain was covered in cerebral spinal fluid. And there was hardly any definition. And they explained to me that, it was hydrocephalus, and it was because of this very large mass that was compressing her brainstem that was also blocking off the flow of the fluid from her brain to the rest of her central nervous system. And when I saw that CAT scan, I remember thinking to myself, oh my goodness, this is why I've been having these dreams, because it was like I was keeping her head above the water. Her brain was drowning in her own cerebral spinal fluid. And I began to understand that dream actually was, like a premonition, something that kind of helped me to deal with the shock of that night. And I remember saying to that same resident who brought us into the CAT scan reading room and saying to him, I just knew, And I remember the look, I still to this day, very vividly, he looked into my face and he said, nothing prepares you for a night like this, and he was right, on many levels, but on another level, there was a preparation that happened for me in that premonition, in that dream. And it kind of helped to guide me to say, like, all right, what's the next thing we have to do? How do we deal with this? And obviously in that first year, she ended up having 6 brain surgeries in the first year. 2 of them were craniotomies for the cavernoma in the brainstem. And the others were, oh my goodness. Yeah, well, I guess there's a golden retriever that may or may not join us here tonight. So it was, she had other surgeries, for the fluid and the shunt. Shunts by nature just malfunction. I think some people have great shunts that don't, but that's not been our experience. So, she had 6 brain surgeries in the first year, and it was a little crazy. But we slowly began to get immersed in the language and the understanding and, early intervention and the therapies and the doctor's appointments and PICU, became kind of like a home away from home for us. And with our other 3 children, there was all the navigating, where do they go? They were actually, they were, let's see, 3, 6, and 9, at the time that she was diagnosed. So it was a lot. That dream, that nightmare, it actually continued. Not all the time, and otherwise I would have found a lot of really good drugs to stop it. No, I'm teasing. But just, it became for me kind of like just a little nudge or reminder that maybe something was coming around, or we were under, like I intuitively knew that something was going on with her. And inevitably I would have a dream either very similar to that or something, but it always ended that same way, that, I was out in the middle of the ocean, holding her, keeping her head above the water, until when she was 8 years old, I had that same nightmare. And that night, for the first time ever, I heard an interior voice in my dream saying to me that you can let go because you're in the ocean of mercy. And when you let go, you'll feel like you're drowning, but I'll teach you a new way of breathing, how to breathe underwater. And I woke up the next day after having that dream, and I wrote it down in my journal. I've been keeping a journal since I was 18 years old. I'm a writer and I write every day. And so I remember writing in my journal and saying, someday I'm going to write a book about this journey. I know it. I know and I knew that there was going to be clues along the way. And even in the 8 years prior to the voice in my dream, I knew that I had learned strategies. And so eventually it wasn't actually, it was 10 years ago now. So, it was about 15 years into Joe's journey that I learned how to put it to paper, to really kind of process, what we had been through and the lessons that we had learned and what I could offer to other people. So I did. I published this fun book, and I'm actually in the process of rewriting it now. It's called Breathing Underwater, a caregiver's journey of hope, or a journey of hope. And I wrote the book actually to be a retreat. I knew that it was an important process for caregivers and people who feel like they're overwhelmed in their circumstances to break away and to have time to reflect. But the reality is that we don't get a lot of that, do we? So I came up with the acronym BREATHE. It was obviously consistent with the message that I had been trying to live my life by. I say to people often when I'm speaking that, that old adage that says, if I can just keep my head above the water, I'll be okay. The reality is, for caregivers, a lot of times we just can't, you know? So I feel like for me, what made sense was that premonition, or that intuition, and knowing that I would have to learn how to breathe when I felt like I was drowning, because my circumstances were not necessarily going to get better. We've had windows where things have been quiet and easy with Joe. As far as for our life, it was easy. For somebody else's life, it might knock them over. But there had to be a way to just keep breathing, even when you feel like you're drowning. So I came up with this acronym, and I'm going to share this with you tonight, and take away from it what you can. We all come to these places with the experience that we have and who we are. So I share from, my experience. So the acronym BREATHE. So the first letter in BREATHE is obviously B. And I came to identify that in order to breathe underwater, to breathe while I feel like I'm drowning, it's essential to believe. Belief is obviously, it's to accept something as true, something that you can count on. For me, my faith is very important to me in that belief, but I believe for all of us as caregivers, especially, it's important to believe that there's somehow a purpose in the struggle, a purpose in the difficulties, a purpose in the caregiving. I found even that using the word caregiver, is important for me to help me to believe that what I was doing and offering to my daughter was purposeful. And caregiving, as opposed to the word caretaking. There's just, when I think of caretaking, I think of, somebody who's taking care of like property. And so I like to use the word caregiving because it helps me to own that I'm making a decision. I'm making a decision to believe that there's a purpose in this struggle, to believe that there's a purpose in the service that I'm providing for my daughter. And it's not a life of servitude and hopeless, it's a life that is meaningful and beautiful. I share with people often when they ask me, how is it, how is this, 24/7, my daughter's developmentally disabled and physically disabled. And so I say to people that our life is beautiful and it's hard, and that's really true. And I believe that where I've come to in this walk is because of that B in breathe. I believe that there is a great purpose in the caregiving. So the R in breathing underwater, and to breathe while we feel like we're drowning, is to rest, so as to restore. Rest doesn't come easy, does it? For caregivers, especially, well, it doesn't matter if it's caregiving for parents, or it's caregiving for children or spouses. We have to rest as caregivers. Excuse me. It's very important to rest so that we can restore. But I think, I'm so sorry, but the rest is, excuse me. Oh, it's so dry here. I'm sorry. So the rest is physical rest, mental rest, spiritual rest, voice rest. Oh my goodness. Excuse me 1 second. Oh my goodness. You need some honey. Okay, now I get to have an advertisement. It's Heavenly Honey from Joe's Bees. It's great for when you're losing your voice. That was weird. Anyway, and I'll get to that later. So it's important to rest. I have found that rest is different in different times. Ideally, we're getting the sleep that we need. Ideally, we have spaces and time where we can get the physical rest, the mental rest, and the spiritual rest that we need. The whole body, mind, and spirit having time to rest. But you know what? I've been in situations with Johanna where we're in the ICU for weeks, and it's not impossible to rest when you're in the ICU. I mean, yeah, it's ideal to get out of the ICU, to take walks, to find, space. But sometimes there's times when you just you can't find that perfect optimal situation. There's no time to, I'm not really a person, as you can tell, that goes out to get my nails done. Some people do. And sometimes that's a place where you can rest and restore. And for me, I need to be out in nature. But even if I'm stuck in a hospital, I found little things like making sure that we're near a window so that I can look out to the window. I can see the sky, I can see the stars at night. I can, I have to say NYU is a beautiful hospital, even though we're in Midtown Manhattan, it's on the water, on the river. And, we always find something beautiful to look at. And so rest can be different for different times in our lives. And I think as caregivers, we need to give ourselves the grace to say, rest for me today might be just going outside and taking a breath. Rest for me today could be that real solid, hours nap. It could be having a great night's sleep. And, but each one of us needs to find, where do we find rest so that we can restore and be refreshed and renewed and get ready to give again, right? Because that's what we do. So we have believe, rest, and the third point in breathing while you feel like you're drowning is to engage, to connect. I remember when I was writing this, I was thinking about the Angioma Alliance, and I think about, all those years ago. I think Johanna was like 7 or 8 when Connie called me, and we were we were sitting in the ICU, and she told me, all about the angioma, about the Alliance, and the research that was being done. And she told me about CCM3 and that, let me understand, that that's really, what we found out that Johanna had, and to know that there were other people, that had CCM3. There weren't many of us, especially in the beginning. Um, but to know that we were not alone, that's what I find when I'm talking about caregivers engaging. It's connecting. And I think the best place to connect as caregivers is to connect with people who understand, your circumstances, what you're going through. You don't have to be fake with them. You don't have to have everything together. And I've found over the years that the people who I can really engage with, who I can really connect with, are the ones that I don't have to explain my circumstance. I can, they'll hear it in my voice, they'll see it in whether my hair is together or totally gray or wherever I am or what, brushed or not. I don't have to put on airs because they know how hard this journey is, and they're willing to help, so connect with people who bring you life. That's what I found. One of my best friends is Johanna's godmother. And she has this little phrase that she says to me. She says, Eileen, sometimes you just make it look too easy. And it's and when I'm really, really stressed, she'll say to me, you're making it look too easy, and I think that it's like, people look at our lives sometimes and they see like the work that we're doing, the advocacy that we're doing, and and they think, wow, that lady's got it all together, or you know and they just think that sometimes they think Johanna can do a whole lot more than she can do. um but I'm okay with that, but I know what's going on behind. I know what I'm doing so that Johanna can sit up straight in the wheelchair. I know the supports that we put in there so that she could do this or that. And it's only in engaging with those people who can look and see the whole picture and understand, and just let me be who I am, as a caregiver and as a mother and as a wife and a friend, and it's really, really important. So I believe we need to believe, to rest, and to engage. The next point is to advocate in breathing underwater while you feel like you're drowning. To advocate, the A in breathe is advocate. It's really whether you feel like or felt like, Darla and I were just talking about, it's like life before diagnosis and after diagnosis. I don't know if I even remember what it was like before, because we're almost 30 years in now, right? Um, but I didn't realize the gifts that I had to advocate. I didn't realize, I didn't realize, I knew I was a writer. I knew I could speak. I could, but when this mama bear instinct kicked in, when I knew that I had to find, for us, in the beginning, like I felt like, I have to fix this. I have to find a cure for this. I have to do, um, that's where I found the strength to advocate. And advocacy, again, like all of these points, looks different at different points of our lives. When Johanna was a baby, it was advocating for the early intervention services that she needed, and to understand, to fight with the insurance company for, the therapy she needed or whatever. And when she was of school age, it was, constantly in conversations with the school district for, what she needed written into her IEP, what services we needed in school, what services we needed at home, all of that. And so you find yourself advocating and advocating in ways that sometimes are very lovely, and sometimes we have to be someone that we didn't think we have to be. 2 years ago, no, not 2 years ago, it was just a year ago now. I was hoping it was 2 years ago. It's not. Um, you know, we're in like a world-class hospital, and it's great. She really does get a lot of really wonderful care, but the transition from pediatric to adulthood is difficult. She's still under the care of her pediatric neurosurgeon, who we saw today. So she's under the care of pediatrics, but we're on adult floors. So what I found is being on an adult floor at this time with her in the ICU or on the regular floor, they just, they don't. I found there's a lot of discrimination toward people with, especially with developmental disabilities, and not understanding, what's needed. COVID interrupted so much of that as well. It really became difficult, especially, we're in Manhattan, so we were at the epicenter of so much of the COVID. And Johanna did have surgery in 2020, and I had to fight, to stay at her side, and to help others understand. Not her own doctors. Her own doctors understood and advocated for us, but it isn't always the neurosurgeon who's in charge. Of even though they could be the admitting doctor, it's where you are and the doctor that's in charge of the ICU or the regular floor. And so sometimes it gets very tiring to fight. But advocacy is key to continuing to breathe and to continuing to live in the midst of these difficulties, and again to even find the purpose in that. And I will tell you that in particular, there was last year, it was this situation where we were in the ER, and she just was not getting what she needed. They were not admitting her properly. It wasn't under neurosurgery. So when she gets admitted under a regular medical floor, it's much harder. She was septic, and so I was trying to advocate because she was in a very scary situation, but they weren't hearing me. And so I found this like advocate inside of me that could have looked like a witch to somebody else, but I knew it was the mama bear instinct. And I discovered the judicious use of the F word. I am pretty much a polite advocate and clear and firm, but I lost it. And they didn't call security, though. They called the head of nursing. And so they recognized that I wasn't just a crazy woman, although I felt crazy. I lost it on them. And sometimes when you're advocating for those you love, you need to just lose it on them and to get what you need. And that was a circumstance that taught me that advocacy isn't always nice. It isn't always polite. Oh, Megan, I'm glad. I'm telling you, I don't use the F word a lot, but when I do, things happen because they, especially the medical people around me, they realize that they need to pay attention. So advocacy is a key strategy for breathing underwater. Okay. The T in breathe is to take time for yourself, obviously, and to trust yourself. I've been expanding this as I'm rewriting this book. So time, I wrote this actually recently, carve out moments often, hours as you can, and days whenever possible. I remember as a young mom, I nursed my kids, and I was involved in Little HA League at the time, and I was a Little HA League leader. We used to talk about this strategy of being a nursing mom with young kids, and just that you just have to take the moments that you can, as you can take them, and to build time for yourself and to build time for your family, but it can come in moments and little chunks. It doesn't necessarily mean that it might not be the time or that we can go off on a vacation to Hawaii, but that doesn't mean that you're not taking time that is meaningful, and time that is really important. So we take the time and we learn to trust ourselves. That trust is huge. As a caregiver, it's so important to trust trusting ourselves and our instincts, that we know what our loved ones need. And we need education in that, we might not know everything that we need. Like today, today was some big conversations with our neurosurgeon, and he's learned to trust me and I've learned to trust him. He knows to trust my instincts. And so we were kind of going a little bit head to head today, but because I've put in the time, in terms of the research, he's put in the time to get to know my daughter and to get to know me. We've been there for about 15 years now. And, you know, I've learned to trust myself, so it's kind of hard when, a world-class neurosurgeon is saying, well, I, I think we're doing okay. And the diagnostic test says this, and that. And I had to sit and point out to him why I thought that A, B, C, and actually even pointed out on the CAT scan, which is a little like, could you tell me, like, why does the ventricle look like that? And that carinoma over there looks like this. And, I've learned a thing or two in reading CAT scans. And it's not perfect. And I don't pretend that I can see it all perfectly, but I've learned to trust that I know what I know, and as I grow, and again, it really does start with taking time, to myself, but also taking the time to put in the research, taking the time to learn from other people, reading the resources that we get from the Alliance and understanding other people's things, that it's helped me to learn to trust myself, and to trust my instincts. I also want to, I just want to be careful of my timing. I want to be careful of my timing. So I wanted to share with you a recent experience I had when it comes to taking time. People who don't live this life, know what's best for me. Not. But, people will often say to me, oh, you need to take more time to yourself. Well, it's true, but I do take time every morning. I have about, an hour, or 90 minutes, like before Johanna wakes up, that, I spend time in meditation and reading and, really trying to center my day and to focus. That helps me to get my day ordered right, so that I know what to do. I don't get away a whole lot, because her care is very complex. We do have really good programs here in New York that we have some excellent caregivers, some professional aides that come in that are paid for by the state, that I administrate the program. And my husband and I work together on things. I do more of the personal care. It's just I'm more comfortable with, the intimate things that I have to do with Johanna, and he's good for the other things that he helps. Like usually he's the one who's feeding her dinner and things like that. And but as far as like getting away by myself overnight, that's always a little complex. So a couple of weeks ago, about a month ago, I was actually asked to give this whole breathing underwater as a retreat, which was really excellent. It was just a general women's retreat, but there were a lot of caregivers on it as well. And I really wanted to do it. And I said yes. And it was a real job, and it was a real joy to do this. But it took, no lie, 5 people to replace me. I like to remind my husband it took 5 people to replace me. So, but it wasn't perfect. Like I didn't go away for the entire weekend. The retreat was down in the Hamptons, so it was very. We live out on the east end of Long Island on the North Fork. This was on the South Fork. So it was only about 30 minutes away from my house. So what we did was we built in a couple of different people for different spots. There was one who was here during the day on Friday to help me so that I could get out the door, and I left. And then I had, from Friday all the way to Saturday evening by myself, and so we have one person who's very close to us. She is a paid aide, but she was first a friend. You know, she's one of those real, true friends. We were friends with her. We met her when Johanna was 2 years old, and she's been a very dear friend of ours and a really fun friend for Johanna. So she, if we need nighttime coverage, she's a teacher during the day. You know, she enjoys coming, you know, at night. So she did the nighttime. And so we put together, you know, different people to come at different times. And I was able to totally disconnect. And I know it sounds crazy, like, you know, oh my gosh, here's my time away as a caregiver and I'm teaching the whole weekend. But I don't ever feel like this is teaching. This is just, it's able to share my story. It's part of my belief system that, you know, this whole journey that we're on has a purpose, you know, and it's a purpose that I can help, you know, particularly women, but even, you know, and other caregivers. So it was a joy for me. It was wonderful. And to be able to then go to sleep that night and to not wonder if, you know, Joe was going to wake up and I didn't think, and I didn't get a text. I didn't, you know, it was just really nice. But that time might look different than it looks for somebody else. So don't feel like you know, when somebody says to you, oh, you have to do this. No, you have to take the time that works for you. You know, you have to trust yourself and take the time. That particular weekend I was able to get a nice solid 30 hours by myself, and then I came home that Saturday night. Joe was already sleeping. And the next morning I woke up and another aide came in to help me get out the door with my husband and she was the Johanna was the crowning talk of the whole presentation. So she actually did the presentation with me that Sunday morning, and that was good. So, you know, in somebody else's world, maybe it would work to go away for an entire weekend. In our world, you know, 30 hours was good for me. So, but that key in learning how to breathe is to take that time and to trust yourself and to trust yourself for what time, you know, you need. The H in breathe is to hope. Hope. I have this favorite saying that has become a big part of our lives. It's based on a scripture that I love, and it says, hope anchors the soul. I have found that, I guess some people, I don't know, it's a little bit more than optimism. You know, I think that hope, the thing that I love about hope is that when you think about the hope we have, you know, the hope that we have for a cure, you know, for cavernous angiomas, you know, the hope that we have that tomorrow is going to be a better day, they're all based on, when you think about it, when you're hoping, it's not something that's right in front of you. It's something that you're imagining can or will happen someday. And so hope is essential to breathing when we feel like we're drowning, because it allows us to get out of that headspace, you know, where it's like, oh, here we are. You know, so even in the most hopeless looking of circumstances, I believe you can always have hope. Hope has become, you know, the integral, you know, daily dose of, you know, it's my primary vitamin, you know. It's the strength, you know, that I have to get through every day. And even when things are difficult and depressing and, you know, or anxiety producing, you know, even when I'm struggling, I just think, you know, maybe it's a little bit of Gone with the Wind and Scarlett O'Hara, you know, I'll think about this tomorrow, you know. Well, if that's what it takes to get through the day, you know, I'm hoping that tomorrow will be better. And sometimes it's hoping that, you know, the afternoon will be a little bit better or the night will be quiet or, you know, but hope is essential to breathing when you feel like you're drowning. Um, for us, hope really became the basis of, we formed our own nonprofit, a 501c called Johanna's Hope. We started a backyard farm during COVID. So, you know, I mean, I was still eating Oreos, but while most people, you know, we just decided to keep going and do something different. But we just had to keep Joe busy because all the programs shut down. We didn't have aides coming into the house, some by choice, some by mandates. We had a lot of mandates in New York. And so we started raising chickens, and chickens then, Johanna said to us, it's about 9 months later after we started raising chickens, she said, Mom, my farm is not a farm without goats. So we now have 6 goats, Nigerian dwarfs. But what the farm did, and we also have bees, and that's why I have Joe's honey that stopped me from coughing. This is actually honey from our backyard, from our wonderful, productive bees. What it did for us was the farm and the farming and the eggs. The honey came later, obviously, but it provided us a connection to our community at a time when we were so segregated from community, when we were scared too ourselves. We didn't know how to handle interactions with people, with the intensity of COVID here in New York. So it was a safe way to bridge that gap for us. And then out of that, one of the major groups that supports people with disabilities, it's called Mary Haven here in New York. They actually came to us and they saw what we were doing with Johanna, and they said, would you ever consider allowing other people with disabilities to come visit the farm, and maybe Johanna could just give them a tour, or and I said, it's been kind of something I've been thinking about for a while, doing something on our own. And so we met for a year. We just opened the farm to other people with disabilities. It was, we started a Arts on Joe's Farm program where we explore the arts and we do art together. And it's only about, 2 hours, and we meet 2 to 3 times a month, definitely 2 times a month, sometimes 4, like in October, it was crazy. And it's just grown and blossomed so that yesterday we had 30 people here in our living room set up for our Friendsgiving. And 20 of those were people with developmental disabilities and autism, and they range in age from 18 all the way up to 62. And so, it all started with hope. We needed something to believe in. We needed something to give us a little more hope when the world was collapsing during COVID. And it's been such a blessing. When we went around, we did a gratitude moment before we had our Thanksgiving meal yesterday. And I can't get through this group without crying at some point. Each person was sharing, what they were thankful for. And so much of it surrounded around this little community of hope. So hope is truly essential. It's not something that is beyond reach. It's right there in front of us. We just have to take the step, to believe that something better is going to come, out of these circumstances. And so finally, the E in breathe is to endure. Endure sounds like a hard word, right? It sounds like, oh, I just gotta buck up and endure this, but I choose to look at endurance. To endure something is that, the difficulties that we're going through, it's kind of like, it's certainly not a sprint, right? Caregiving is a marathon, and it's we are building muscle, we're building mind, memory muscle, we're building physical muscles. I've done so much strength training. Thank God, Johanna's decline has been slow, so that, and also her weight changes have fluctuated. So I've been really, I can now lift 110 pounds pretty well. My husband and I have found strategies, for, putting her into bed, helping her into the wheelchair, and doing, but that's on the physical end. You build endurance through what we struggle, but we also build endurance, mentally and spiritually and imaginatively, intuitively. All of those things, if we take a look at caregiving, not as this overwhelming task that we just have to get through. But as this experience that, like I said, is hard and beautiful, that is building something more precious in our lives and is serves a greater purpose. And that doesn't mean it's not hard, but it does mean that in the end, it really is worth it, right? It really is worth it to love another person to the point where we're having to lay down some of our desires and our hopes and our dreams and find new ones, or but I find in learning to endure, I have strengths that I did not know that I had before. I never knew I was going to be able to read a CAT scan or, advocate for my daughter for brain surgery or not, or, to learn to recognize, what a seizure looks like and to learn the different rescue medications and what would be best in this situation and what would be best in that one. And, I keep notes every day because she's on a lot of medicine, so, we have a care plan and we have notes and we keep notes. And, I've become a tremendous supervisor, of all the aides. And, I definitely am multitasking a lot. So, but I've built endurance, through 28 years of this. And in the end, like I said yesterday, to our group, in particular, this week, I've been reflecting a lot that it's been 28 years exactly, this week that we started this journey. And as difficult as it's been, there has been so much beauty. And I am so grateful. I mean, yes, do I wish that Johanna wasn't born with CCM3? Do I wish that, she didn't have so many surgeries, that it wasn't this hard, that, that she wasn't in a wheelchair or developmentally disabled? Yeah, but she is, and in the midst of that, she's beautiful, and our life is hard and our life is beautiful. So in finally reflecting, I just want to go over these points in breathing underwater. The first one is to believe in a higher purpose, in something beyond ourselves, in this caregiving. To rest so as to restore. The E is to engage and connect with others. The A is for advocacy, finding that inner advocate within ourselves, advocating for what we need in the midst of the struggle. The T is to take time and to trust ourselves. The H is to hope, even when you feel like there may not be a way out, to hope for tomorrow to be a better day. And finally, the E, to endure, and builds that endurance through what we struggle. Finally, when you feel like you're drowning in the midst of these difficulties, it's just very simple. Remember to breathe. So I hope that this has somehow encouraged you. I am wondering if we can have a Q&A at all. Is there any way we can talk?
Yes. Hi. That was
Darla?
beautiful, Eileen. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
So we have about 10 minutes for Q&A. We have a couple of questions in
Sure.
the Q&A already. And I don't know if people have put any in the chat in the last minute or two,
Okay.
but we would prefer if you could put the questions in the Q&A. They're easier for me to track down. So I will go ahead and ask, I'll ask the first one. I have cavernoma spread in my brain and many different symptoms and difficulties. And lately, this person has had difficulty with more cognitive issues like memory and concentrating and planning, keeping up with conversations, that sort of thing. And they're wondering, as a caregiver, if you know any good tips of how they can get their own loved ones to understand that they do listen. They are trying to respond, but that they often will sometimes still forget. It's not about them not listening.
I can tell you one thing that Johanna has done that has helped us, honestly, even in the midst of where she's at developmentally. She's very intuitively intelligent, and she'll just put her hand up and say, give me time. you know, give me time. And she doesn't articulate it as much now, but because it always, the give me time, to speak, was accompanied by this, she still might not articulate that as much now, but we get this, and so I, I think letting them in a little bit, not trying to keep up, and say that, I need the time, to process what you're saying. I need the time to speak, to understand. And I hope that they will hear you too. I lost you on the audio,
That's
Darla.
me.
I can't.
Sorry, I'm muted.
Okay.
The next question is if your book is available as an audiobook.
No, but the next update will be. I definitely will do that because I'm a big fan of audiobooks, and I think I'm gonna read it myself.
Nice, good.
Yeah.
A lovely voice.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions? We have a little more time if you guys have other questions. I will remind everybody that we do have support group right after this meeting. If you're interested in hopping on our support group, I will put the link in the chat. And we've got lots of thank yous in the chat and lots of appreciation, Eileen.
Thank you.
It is Caregiver Appreciation Month. We do appreciate all of you caregivers. It's hard, man. It's hard.
It is hard. It really, really is. It is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One
Sure.
of the things that we were talking about before we started the webinar was the feeling that maybe some people don't want to identify as caregivers, possibly because their person they take care of isn't as severely impacted as somebody else might be, and so they don't feel like they count as a caregiver. So, yeah.
I think there's a stigma attached to caregiving too, that there's like, think of it like very negatively, I think there's a fear attached to it. What if I have to become a caregiver, and that's why I really advocate for finding, to find the purpose in it, because it's a very noble, lofty purpose. And when you reframe the way you're looking at caregiving, there's all these gifts, that emerge, so
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, no, it's true. It's really true. So.
All right. Well, I'm gonna give folks another 30 seconds or so to pop any questions into the Q&A that they
Okay.
have, and then we will wrap it up.
And you sent the, let's see, you sent the link. Right. Okay, I see it
Yeah, I
there.
did put the link
Okay,
in
cool.
okay, we have a couple of questions. So, do you see caregiving as a full-time job?
Well, interesting you should say that. I guess it is. It's kind of like a song that plays in the back of my head all the time, and sometimes it's not a pretty tune. But I do see it as full time. In New York, we have a CDPAP program right now, although I hate to say it, but Governor Hochul is kind of dismantling our program right now. So my husband and I are paid as caregivers. And we also do have aides. So we provide more of the personal care for her, the showering, the dressing, things like that. And the aides that come in are more community habilitation aides, so they'll do more, they do the fun stuff is what I say, they do the activities. We do fun stuff, obviously. So, my hours are usually in the early morning, and sometimes, usually start about 4 o'clock in the morning, as far as paid hours. So in that sense, for us, in the program that we have, and I hope that programs like this will continue, and that I think it's really important for us to advocate to our state and federal government that, they need to see caregiving, the family caregivers and what we provide, is such a resource for the taxpayer. It really is. And it's allowed us to be a little more comfortable. Honestly, the way that we were able to start the nonprofit was because we were being paid as caregivers, and we used some of that money, obviously for our own family budget. But then during COVID, well, we weren't doing anything else, so we started that, and it was the seed money for our nonprofit was even that. So I think it's important to advocate for even the paid professional positions at home, because family caregivers are essential and should be compensated so that we can stay home. So, and my husband and I both work from home as well. Me as a freelance writer and speaker, and then him, he does all web designing and webinars and seminars and things like that. So we are able to work from home, which is good and bad. So,
Absolutely. We
mhm.
have a question from Megan. She would like to know if you ever have difficulty saying yes to things in the future, because you're worried about having to cancel.
Yeah, that's a yeah, it's tough. When I take speaking things, I speak a lot for a lot of women's group stuff, actually in different parts of the country and stuff, but I will say to them, there's a possibility, you're taking a little bit of a risk, with me, this is what I can tell you I will do. But there is always the situation, the possibility that I won't be able to come, but the only time I really do cancel, and I think I've only now actually when I've been solely the speaker, I've never had to cancel. But when there's things that I'm participating in that I don't go to, is if Johanna is physically in the ICU and, not stable. Like even if she's in the ICU and it's a local event that I have to do, I could possibly do that if she's stable enough. It is a little scary, but again, I try to have, a backup plan. Even there was one time that I was speaking upstate in Buffalo, and it was looking a little iffy. She had a lot of bleeding in the brain, and I came up with somebody who could do the talk, not the same talk, but another talk, and I got them a sub that they didn't need, because in the end, she was able to stabilize. The other thing that we do is we do things a little creatively. That I frequently bring Johanna with me. And it's not because, I can't have coverage, but she adds so much, like that retreat that I just gave last month. I knew that it would work out well for her and my schedule if she came with me on Sunday, but I also knew she was the icing on the cake, and she was the visual aid, because I've been sharing our whole story, and sharing all these strategies. I break it down, slower, because it's in a weekend format. But, she was the final talk, and it all came together in her little person, and then she shared this little song. And, so I think we need to get creative and courageous, be creative in what we're scheduling, be courageous in what we're trying to do, and be honest, especially, like I was getting paid, to do that retreat last month, and it was a lot of money. And I was a little worried, but I thought I'm going to find a way, and of course it helped, because it was only 30 minutes away, from the house. So like I said, even if she was in Manhattan, I probably could have done it, just it would have been a little more challenging. So does that help?
That's a great answer. I love it. Um, all right. On that note, it is officially 8 o'clock, and so we do need
Okay,
to roll off
you're
here so we can
welcome.
go over to support group. Thank you so much, Eileen. This was
You're
really,
welcome.
really a special night. I appreciate you hanging out with us.
Thank you. I would like to try to come to the support group. I'm going to touch base and see if usually Joe's in bed by this time. I'm going to see where she's at and see if I can get her into bed and come back
Let
for
me
the
know if
support group.
you, okay, if you need the link or anything, let me know.
It's in the, so
It's in the
could you
chat, but
email
once
it?
I close this meeting, you won't see it anymore.
Okay.
I'll send it to your email.
Okay, that's great. And I will, if I come in, I might just be a couple of minutes late, but I'd like to like see
That
and
would be
hear other
nice.
people.
Yeah, that'd be lovely. All right.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye, guys. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.